The bushfire is as much a part of the Australian scene as the countryside it devastates. As evidence, it's been sweeping our eucalyptus forests at regular intervals for thousands of years. The first white man to report one was Abel Tasman, who found parts of the forest of Van Diemen's Land alight in 1642. A century and a half later, Cook wrote of the continent of smoke he discovered further north. The bushfire is part of Australia's natural environment. Only when man finds himself caught up in its pattern does it become disaster.
Bushfires have been part of the Australian bush way of life for millions of years at least. We have weather which every year provides the right sort of conditions for bushfires to break out. We have evidence from the fact that so many of our trees are adapted to survive bushfire, and adaptation takes many millions of years. It's fairly clear that there always have been bushfires in Australia. What's different now, of course, is since the coming of the white man particularly, is we've done things to the bush. We've cleared the bush and we've built homes, we've built cities, we've put in farms and stocked them with farm animals and so on. So a bushfire passing through nowadays does a great deal more damage to people's way of life and property and livelihood than it did before the white man came.
The Blue Mountains on the morning of a disaster, December 16th, 1977, Friday. It's been an exceptionally dry winter and authorities have been worried for some time that this could be a bad year. The normal restrictions on fires in the open have been brought forward and fire reduction programs accelerated. Today there are two troublesome fires burning in the Wentworth Falls and Hazelbrook areas, but the forecast is for gentle southerly winds. It looks as if the danger will pass, and then almost within minutes the lower Blue Mountains are involved in a holocaust. In only 5 hours, the flames have claimed a terrible toll. 1 person is dead, 300 are homeless, several thousand have been evacuated, 70 homes have been destroyed, roads and railway lines cut, and thousands of hectares of bushland blackened, all in the space of just one afternoon. Saturday morning, and in the stillness that often follows in the wake of a bushfire, the tallying up begins. One question many people are asking today is, what went wrong with the weather forecast? The prediction had been for gentle southerlies. The volunteer firefighters relaxed and many were away from home when the violent northerlies whipped up the firestorm.
Now what happened on that particular Friday before the Blue Mountains weekend was that a front appeared, virtually appeared from nowhere, and it totally upset the forecast. It was not a thing which at our present state of knowledge about weather we could have predicted. And the sad fact is that it changed the bushfire risk very badly, very considerably that day. It was thought to be only a moderate day, and in fact it turned out to be a very, very high day because of that change in the weather system.
48 hours later, and there's every chance of a repeat performance. The firefighters are on the alert again and they're watching the breeze closely. It's predicted it'll swing to the southwest. The temperature's going up and the humidity's going down. All the ingredients for what they call a doomsday situation. At 10 minutes past 1, the wind swings around as the forecasters said it would. It gusts up to 80 knots and the fight's on again. This time the situation's a different one. Although the fight is just as desperate, the firefighters are ready for it. 2,000 homes are threatened, but they lose only 1 as the force of 1,500 firefighters holds on.
This fire now has burnt something in the region of 10 times as much ground as the 1968 fire, and the losses are less than half. Keeping my fingers crossed because it's early days. But it's good. Everyone's working very well together. You can see probably the amount of resources and reserves we've got, and now it's up to the weather.
So we are learning something.
Oh, I think so.
By the following Tuesday, 2 days later, the third major fire disaster in the Blue Mountains in 20 years is over. Total insurance payout will be $2 million. A coroner's inquest was to find the fires had been deliberately lit by young people, identity unknown. Our national parks. On a good Sunday, it's not unusual for 20,000 people to visit just one park, and with each visitor, the chance of a fire outbreak is increased. That's why control is exercised so rigidly and carefully in places like these. But authorities can't watch the behaviour of every person who ventures out of doors, and unfortunately many of the people who come into the bush for relaxation know too little about it. The majority of Australians live in cities. Up to 1/3 of us were born in other countries, often where bushfires are unknown. As a result, few of us are even slightly experienced in the ways of the bush, and we must be taught there's a whole new set of rules to abide by out here if we don't want to destroy this very fragile bushland. Golden rules like knowing the places and times fires can be safely lit, of always taking note of the official bushfire hazard forecasts and warnings which appear on road signs, newspapers, TV and radio, and remembering to make sure the barbecue or campfire is out when you've finished. Many a disastrous bushfire has started from a fundamental piece of carelessness like this. Bushfires result from a combination of factors: the temperature, the humidity, the wind, the dryness of the vegetation, and of course something to ignite the fuel. Well, is this how bushfires start?
It's one of the long-standing myths, I guess, about bushfires, that so many of them begin with light shining through broken bottles lying in the bush. But if it is a cause, it's a very, very minor cause indeed. In fact, I can't find any mention of it in books that I've read about the origins of bushfires. There seem to be three major causes. First of all, there are natural causes, of which perhaps the most important is lightning. And since we've had fires for a long time in Australia, lightning probably always has been quite an important cause. Secondly, there are fires which are started deliberately, now either for malicious reasons, intended to cause damage, or else fires which are started for another purpose, burning off or something like this, and which then get out of control. Now that's a very, very important cause of bushfires. And thirdly, there are miscellaneous causes of a human nature, such as, and this is quite an interesting one, power lines which might be brought down by a falling tree and which then spark into dry bushland and cause a fire. That's an interesting one because it quite often happens a long way from centres of civilization. When fires begin for that sort of reason or because of lightning, they quite often burn out a lot of area of land before they can be brought under control. Undoubtedly, a great many fires are due simply to foolishness. People doing silly things, burning off on days when the weather simply is not appropriate, when the wind is too strong, when it's too dry, when it's too hot. And if people could be brought to realise that there are times for burning off, and there are times when burning off is a stupid thing to do, then the number of bushfires undoubtedly would be greatly decreased.
Hobart 1967. The bushfires that devastated the Tasmanian capital were Australia's worst natural disaster to that date. In half a day they killed 62 people and destroyed 1,000 homes and 130 major buildings, a total of $40 million worth of damage. The energy expended in these fires far exceeded the energy of several atom bombs, and Hobart looked like a war-torn city. A committee report after the disaster said,
"Generally, there was a lack of public appreciation of the fire danger. This contributed to the severity of the losses that occurred. The vast majority of people never contemplated that such a thing could happen."
For about 7 hours before the fires swept Hobart, authorities warned the fire hazard rating for the day was extremely high, and yet a number of fires were lit on that day. This failure of people to listen for and heed the warnings contributed to one of the worst disasters our country has known. This is why authorities implore you to check the official bushfire hazard forecast constantly during the season. And whenever you light a fire, put it out when your cooking is finished. Use water, sand or earth. And remember, it requires one forgotten spark to set the bush alight. Ever since we began to build among these eucalypt forests, we've been playing Russian roulette with fire, and it's strange how many people have failed to learn the rules for survival here. The most obvious error is to allow trees and shrubbery to grow around the house. Comes the day when the wind is right and fire sweeps down on the building, there's little to stop it from exploding the way everything else is exploding around it. The grounds of this house are by comparison a refuge. Firemen say the chances of a house surviving depend more on the nature of its surroundings than anything else. Houses are destroyed by bushfires because small fires have been allowed to start inside them and remain alight. Often they burn down after the main fire has passed. This can be prevented by clearing the grounds and the guttering of debris, boxing in the eaves and storing inflammables in a safe place. When the challenge comes, perhaps on the back of a 60-knot wind, you might not be lucky enough to have an army of helpers like this to clear away inflammable debris. But you can fight your own battles by having a hose and water ready, blocking the downpipes, filling the gutters with water, closing the windows and doors, and preparing wet bags and blankets for shelter and firefighting, and staying with the house. The danger is usually passed in minutes. In case things get too bad, have the car ready and make sure it's in a clear area. It too could end up a fire victim.
The essential feature is fuel. It has to be something for the fire to burn, and this is the sort of stuff that a bushfire feeds on. Leaf mould, litter, twigs, small leaves, that sort of thing. Very dry, and the fire gets a hold on that, and that's where it all begins. And if there's some way of reducing the amount of this sort of fuel lying around on the ground, then we have a chance of restricting the spread of bushfires. We can't control the weather on the whole, we can't control the shape of the ground, those sort of factors, but we can control the amount of fuel on the ground by burning off, by controlled burning. And that's a very important way of restricting the damage done by bushfires.
The most effective way to get rid of fuel is to burn it off. Fire controllers say that most Australians are aware of the need to prevent bushfires. They say this awareness is probably greatest in Western Australia, Victoria and South Australia, states where fuel reaches a critically hazardous condition every summer. And in Tasmania they haven't forgotten the lessons of 1967. But the experts say that in New South Wales and Queensland, public attitudes are less consistent. Because the fire danger varies from year to year, apathy sets in.
Some councils are right on the ball. They keep the hazard down and they issue hazard reduction orders on properties that are neglected, and they keep everything safe. But we have got some of these so-called environmentalists. I'm not talking about the one that genuinely understands the bush, but the one that thinks it's a shame to burn anything at all. If you get a lobby of those people together, the councils give in and they don't issue hazard reductions and they won't allow burning off, with the result that it's just turned into a haystack that gets alight and no one can control it.
The strongest criticism of burning off in forest areas arises from the long-term damage it's likely to cause to the bush and the creatures in it. In the name of property protection, could we be destroying the environment we enjoy living amongst? David Ellyards.
Well, here's an area where controlled burn was done about 6 months ago, and you can see the bush is still standing. Important thing to notice is on the ground there's virtually no leaf litter at all, and so the major purpose of the controlled burn, which is to remove the leaf litter and so cut down the risk of a very intense fire, that's been achieved. Now, very good example here of the effect of fire on the sort of plants we have in the Australian bush. Now, this part of the trunk here, very blackened, but over here we see fresh shoots already coming through. A great many trees in the Australian bush are pre-programmed, as it were, to respond to fire. There are buds underneath the bark, and once a fire has damaged some part of the tree, hormones are released into the tree and these buds pop out.
So that wouldn't do any permanent damage to the tree?
No, the sort of fire which happened here, a low intensity fire, would not do any permanent damage to the tree. In fact, it does very little permanent damage at all. It removes the leaf litter. It probably kills some of the microscopic animals which live in the leaf litter, but most other animals are able to escape. And the point about controlled burning is it tries to make all fires moderate fires, low intensity fires, try and prevent the very intense ones which can in fact damage trees and which can in fact help to destroy wildlife.
One of the most spectacular community reactions to the bushfire threat was the formation around the turn of the century of the Volunteer Bushfire Brigade movement. With modest government assistance, it has developed into a highly organised and distinctive firefighting system. It's a force unlike any other in the world and has a membership of some 300,000. Men like these and the professionals from urban brigades soon develop a healthy respect for the dangers of fire, of temperatures that can draw 2 litres of water from your body in an hour, of flying particles that can blind, of smoke inhalation and heat stroke and burns. Because bushfires are not discriminating, anyone can find himself turned firefighter, and that's where danger can arise from ignorance of some basic rules. First, are you dressed for the occasion? The rule is don't turn out in thongs, t-shirts and shorts. Bad burns and severe blisters can result from radiant heat. Take a lesson from the firefighters. Wear long trousers, long-sleeved shirts, hats. And don't forget the Tasmanian experience when 11 people died in one afternoon fighting fires. All were inexperienced, so learn to know the enemy. The people who know him best and can tell you most are the state and local bushfire authorities. They have the experience, the expertise and the responsibility in both preventing and fighting this menace of the bush. Education is important to them as actually putting out fires. In each state, these widely dispersed groups of firefighters are coordinated by a government authority. Pick out the one in your state and make a note of its title. This is the body to approach if ever you need information about a bushfire situation. When the phones ring in this room, it usually means disaster on a huge scale, an event like Cyclone Tracy or the massive bushfires of southwestern New South Wales in 1977. This is the operations centre of the Natural Disasters Organisation in Canberra. The federal group called in when a fire or similar catastrophe gets beyond the control of the state emergency forces. The NDO not only awaits disaster, it also helps alert people to danger too. It conducts campaigns like this with the help of local emergency organisations to educate the public on the bushfire. This pamphlet explains fire danger ratings, and that raises the question of just who decides a day will be bad for bushfires and how.
Today is not very hot, probably around 24. It's about average humidity. The wind is quite gentle. It's from the south. It's not the sort of hot north-westerly winds, which are very important in fanning big bushfires. And also because we have had a bit of rain and it's not been very hot over the last couple of weeks, we are faced today with a moderate bushfire risk. That's only one position, of course, on our 5-point scale, which goes from low. Now at the low end, bushfires will virtually put themselves out. Up the top end here, extreme bushfire risk. Up here, a bushfire becomes almost unstoppable. It's fanned by a strong wind, it's on a very hot day, a very dry day, and feeding on very dry fuel, and it becomes almost impossible to put out. So that covers the spectrum. One very important point is that this is based on research which extends back 15 years. And researchers in this area have in fact lit perhaps 1,000 or more trial fires under a variety of weather conditions, the conditions of dryness of the fuel and so on, to see what are the important factors in determining bushfire risk. And the result of all their research, well, it's right here.
The importance of understanding. These people didn't know the rules and perished on a roadside. Bushfires cause most casualties when they burst on the inexperienced or trap the unprepared. An example, when fire blocks a highway and suddenly involves motorists, some of whom have never seen an outbreak like this before. Such an incident killed 8 people in one blow in a South Australian fire and 17 on a Victorian expressway. The rules for survival here are quite simple, but too easily forgotten in the terror of the moment. In a grass fire, your safety is usually assured in a sedan or other enclosed vehicle. The petrol tank won't explode. Put the lights on, close up everything, get down low, shelter under a blanket or rug, and wait out the fire. In the case of a grass fire, this should be little more than a few seconds. In a heavy forest fire, look for a clearing or a culvert. Another example of a crisis situation that can strike even in the suburbs. If your house is threatened, should you stay and fight or leave it to chance the fire and the wind? Here's the advice of a veteran firefighter who's seen whole streets of houses endangered.
I'm not in favour of evacuation, and most fire authorities aren't. If the worst happened and that house caught fire, by the time it was a hazard to the people in the house, it would be safe for them to come outside because the fire would have passed. The thing that kills us in fire is radiated heat. If we stay in the house, we're protected from that radiated heat. If we try to outrun it, we're bound to get caught. If we pack up in the car and leave, we've left our asset. If those people got a swimming pool there, if the mains fail because the demands by fire vehicles, they've got water there, I'd say my advice would be stay there.
A survey conducted after one of Victoria's worst fire seasons would seem to bear out the wisdom of staying with your house. It studied the cases of 11 people who died while trying to escape the fires. It found that over half the houses deserted by the victims in the face of the fire were not burnt, and it came to the conclusion that most of these people would have survived if they'd remained in their dwellings. It's not surprising in this large flat continent of ours that the most desirable place to build a house is on a slope. Most of our capital cities have hills nearby, and our housing has spread into them in long fingers along the ridges. Tree-shrouded perches that gamble with fire, because fires burning up slopes travel faster and hotter than any others. In the last Blue Mountains fires, the flames travelled 22 kilometres in 5 hours and reached 20 metres in height. The energy released would have powered Sydney or Melbourne for several days. But why do fires burn better up slopes? This model used in a Film Australia production shows what happens. The fire moves slowly downhill. It hits the gully and then starts to pick up speed. It's preheating the fuel ahead of it, and within a short time will have doubled in velocity. By the time it reaches the ridge, it's like a giant blowtorch. It takes several years for conditions to build up to such an inflammable level, but at the same time it's this breathing space between disasters that can lead residents to a fatal complacency.
If we had fires occur here every year, or in the vicinity at regular intervals, these local people may be more concerned. But because the frequency is so far apart, it's difficult for them to perceive the hazards.
And so we see sites like this on a ridge that was straddled by fire several years ago, just long enough past for the shock to wear off and the fuel to build up on the roof again. Police are worried too about people who may have stored petrol near or under their houses during the recent fuel droughts, an added hazard in an already dangerous situation. Preparedness, of course, is the key to survival in bushfire territory. Fires in gullies have a particular menace for the people battling them. Equipment is hard to get in and winds can be treacherous. If a situation like this can be a worry to experienced firefighters, how does a person unfamiliar with the Bushfire Act if he's confronted with one?
If you're in the path of the thing with no possible means of escape, of getting out of the range of the fire front, you would look for a hollow, a depression, a log, a rock outcrop to protect yourself from that radiated heat. If you had matches and you had time, it would be perfect to burn out an area to give yourself protection. But down close to the ground, less problem with smoke, and protect yourself, pull your coat or whatever up over your face to protect as much of your skin as you can from radiated heat. That's what kills us.
So know your enemy when dealing with fire, and know your weather too. Fire behaviour is closely related to weather, an obvious point many people fail to recognise, sometimes with disastrous results.
Well, I think that the forecast is that for all its problems, and perhaps for some of its inaccuracies, it's by far the best thing we have to go on. And in terms, say, of what people do with burning off, whether they're going to burn off on a certain day, please take notice of the bushfire warning, of what bushfire risk there is on that particular day. You're far safer ground than trusting your own judgment on the matter.
The bushfire is a disaster that can involve all Australians. As we've seen in this film, we can all contribute to keeping its destructive nature to a minimum simply by listening to some well-researched information. The urban fringe dweller. To survive in your attractive but high fire risk zone, note the advice of the bushfire authorities and never ignore the official fire danger rating forecasts and warnings. The city dweller. You have seen how you can contribute to the bushfire menace. You too must always note the fire danger rating forecasts before entering a high-risk area and observe those simple and necessary safety precautions while you're there. It really takes such little effort and thought to avoid the bushfire, our summer fate.